He was the king of rock and roll. He sold over 1 billion records. His home, Graceland, is the second most visited house in America, right after the White House. But on August 16th, 1977, Elvis Presley died at 42 years old. The official story was a heart attack. A simple, tragic end. But the hours leading up to his death are a fog of conflicting stories. The people closest to him, the ones who were there, can't seem to agree on the most basic facts. What did he eat? What were his last words? When did he actually die? The more you look at the eyewitness accounts, the more they fall apart. It's not just a matter of foggy memories. It's a collection of contradictions that paint a confusing and much darker picture of his final day. We are left with a puzzle. Or a puzzle where every piece is from a different box. Why can no one agree on what happened? Word number 15, was there a cover-up? This is the biggest question of all. It hangs over every other inconsistency. Was there a deliberate effort to hide the truth about how Elvis died? The evidence points to yes. The story starts with his father, Vernon Presley. When the autopsy was done, Vernon was a grieving father trying to protect his son's legacy. He was handed the initial autopsy report, and he reportedly had it sealed for 50 years. That original document will not be available to the public until 2027. Think about that. The full medical truth about the death of one of the most famous people in history is locked away. The official cause of death announced to the world by medical examiner Dr. Jerry Francisco was cardiac arrhythmia. In simple terms, his heart stopped beating. Dr. Francisco was firm that drugs played no part in his death. He said the drugs found in Elvis's system were at therapeutic levels. This was the story the world was told. The story of a tired heart giving out. It was clean, it was tragic, and it was likely not the whole truth. Years later, the story changed. Investigations, particularly one led by the Tennessee Board of Medical Examiners against Elvis's doctor, Dr. George Nicopolis, revealed a very different picture. The toxicology report was eventually made public. It showed not 2 or 3 drugs, but at least 10 different prescription medications in his system. We're talking about high levels of codeine, an opiate. There was Valium, Placidol, and a cocktail of other sedatives and painkillers. Pathologist Dr. Cyril Wecht, a noted forensic expert who reviewed the findings, was blunt. He believed Elvis died from polypharmacy and overdose from the combination of all these drugs. He said the story of a simple heart attack was nonsense. So you have 2 conflicting narratives. One from the initial medical examiner, Dr. Francisco, saying drugs were not a factor, and another from a team of investigators and other pathologists saying drugs were the central factor. Why the difference? The book, Elvis: The Final Years by Jerry Hopkins, suggests immense pressure was put on the medical examiner's office. The Presley family, the city of Memphis, everyone had an interest in keeping Elvis's image clean. An overdose was sordid. A heart attack was a tragedy. Alana Nash, in her deeply researched book, Elvis and the Memphis Mafia, talks about the chaos at the hospital. She describes how the Memphis Mafia, Elvis's inner circle, were trying to control the narrative from the very beginning. They were removing items from Graceland. They were managing the story. Vernon was in charge, and his goal was clear: protect the boy. So you have a sealed autopsy, a public statement that minimizes the role of drugs, and a later toxicology report that screams overdose. These aren't simple mistakes. They look like a coordinated effort. The initial cause of death listed on the death certificate was challenged. In fact, there were reports of 2 different death certificates being filed. One that was clean, and one that was more complicated. This suggests confusion at best, and a deliberate cover-up at worst. What we still don't know is haunting. Who made the final decision to push the heart attack narrative? Was Dr. Francisco pressured, and if so, by whom specifically? What exactly is in that sealed 1977 autopsy report that is so different from what was later revealed? And when it is finally unsealed in 2027, will it tell us the definitive truth? Or will it just be another piece of a puzzle designed to be unsolvable? Number 14, what was his final mood? Was Elvis happy and looking forward to the future, or was he a depressed, sick man who knew the end was near? The people who saw him last can't agree. This is one of the most fundamental contradictions. His state of mind tells us if his death was a shocking accident or an inevitable conclusion. The happy Elvis story comes mainly from his fiancée, Ginger Alden. In her book, Elvis and Ginger, she paints a picture of a man making plans. She says they had just set a wedding date. He was excited about his upcoming tour, which was set to start on August 17th. He was talking about the future, about having more children. According to her, his mood was upbeat. He played racquetball in the middle of the night. He sang songs at the piano. This is the Elvis that his estate and many fans want to remember: optimistic, full of life, and tragically cut down in his prime. Joe Esposito, his road manager, also pushed this narrative in some of his interviews. He focused on the tour preparations, the business of being Elvis. It was life as usual. But then there's the other side, the sick Elvis story. This comes from almost everyone else. His cousins Billy and Rick Stanley, who were with him at Graceland, tell a different tale. In their book, Elvis, We Love You Tender, they describe a man in serious physical and emotional pain. He was overweight, bloated, and constantly medicated. They talk about his paranoia, his isolation. He wasn't the vibrant man Ginger Alden describes. He was a man struggling to get through the day. Larry Geller, Elvis's spiritual advisor and hairdresser, supports this darker view. Geller was with Elvis in his final months, and in his book, If I Can Dream Elvis's Own Story, he writes about Elvis's deep spiritual searching, but also his profound unhappiness. He knew his health was failing. He was obsessed with books about death and the afterlife. He felt trapped by his own fame. Geller's account is of a man looking for a way out, not a man planning a wedding. The physical evidence backs up the sick Elvis story. He had a host of health problems. High blood pressure and enlarged colon, liver damage. He was not a well man. The idea that he was in a great mood and planning a tour seems to ignore the reality of his physical condition. His own doctor, Dr. Nicopolis, testified during his trial that Elvis was a man dealing with chronic pain from a variety of ailments. That doesn't sound like a man who was feeling on top of the world, so which is it? Was Ginger Alden seeing what she wanted to see, or was she deliberately creating a more pleasant memory to protect him and herself? Or perhaps Elvis was a man of extreme mood swings. Maybe he was both happy and depressed in his final hours. The human mind is complex, but the accounts are so black and white, so completely opposite, that it feels like more than just a matter of perspective. It feels like two different men are being described. One on the brink of a new beginning, the other on the edge of an abyss. Why do Ginger Alden's memories of a happy, planning Elvis stand in such stark contrast to the accounts of the Stanley brothers and Larry Geller? Was Elvis putting on a performance for his new fiancée, hiding his true pain? Or are the others exaggerating his decline to make their own stories more dramatic? What was his real emotional state when he went into that bathroom for the last time? Was he hopeful, or had he simply given up? Number 13. What was the last song he sang? The final song Elvis ever sang has become a piece of folklore. The story goes that in the early morning hours of August 16th, after returning from a late-night dentist appointment, Elvis sat down at the piano in his Graceland home. As he played and sang a few songs. The last one was Blue Eyes Crying in the Rain. It's a beautiful, poignant story. The song, originally by Roy Acuff and made famous by Willie Nelson, is a melancholy ballad about love and loss. It feels like the perfect poetic ending. This story is told by many, including his cousin Billy Smith, who was there that night. It's often cited in documentaries and biographies as his final musical statement. It paints a picture of a soulful, reflective Elvis sharing a quiet musical moment with his family and his girlfriend, Ginger Alden. It's a peaceful image. But is it true? Like, so much about that night, the details are fuzzy. While Billy Smith and his wife Jo were there, and they confirm he played the piano, not everyone agrees on the final song. Some accounts say he played a few gospel tunes. Elvis loved gospel music. It was his comfort food. It would make sense for him to turn to it in a quiet moment. Larry Geller often spoke of how Elvis would use gospel music to find peace. So, was it a gospel song? Ginger Alden, in her own book, confirms he was at the piano. But the focus of her memory is on the moment, the feeling, not a specific set list. The chaos and trauma of what happened just hours later could easily cloud the memory of a particular song. Good memory researchers like Elizabeth Loftus from the University of California, Irvine, have shown time and again how memory is not a recording. It's a reconstruction, and it can be influenced by later suggestions. The story of Blue Eyes Crying in the Rain is such a good story, so fitting, that it might have become the accepted memory, whether it was the literal truth or not. The problem is the story has become more important than the fact. It provides a perfect cinematic ending. The king singing a sad country song about final goodbyes just before he dies. It's almost too perfect, and that's what makes it suspicious. The reality of that night was likely more mundane. He was probably just noodling at the piano, playing whatever came to mind. It may not have had a clear beginning or a definitive end. The focus on one last song might be a way for us to make sense of a senseless death. We want his life to have a neat narrative arc, but life is rarely that neat. The truth is likely messier. He played some songs, he went upstairs, he died. The idea of a grand, final musical statement might be a fiction we created to comfort ourselves. So, did he really sing Blue Eyes Crying in the Rain as his last song? Or is this a piece of romantic folklore that has been repeated so often it has become fact? Could the last thing he played have been a simple gospel hymn or just an unfinished melody? And does it even matter what the song was? Or have we put meaning onto a random moment to make his death feel less abrupt and more profound? It's number 12. Did the racquetball game really happen? One of the strangest stories from Elvis's last night is the racquetball game. According to the official timeline, Elvis, his cousin Billy Smith, his girlfriend Ginger Alden, and Billy's wife Jo went to Elvis's private racquetball court on the Graceland grounds around 4 a.m. They supposedly played for a little while. This story is often used to show that Elvis was active and in good spirits. It's a detail that makes him seem more normal, more alive. The scene sounds almost surreal. 4 people playing a clumsy game of racquetball in the middle of the night. Elvis, who was known to be in poor physical condition, sweating it out on the court just hours before his death. In some versions of the story, he even strains himself while trying to hit the ball and falls into a chair, laughing it off. It's a vivid image, but there are serious questions about whether this event happened as described, or if it happened at all. Firstly, Elvis's physical state. He was 250 pounds, maybe more. He suffered from a range of health issues and was heavily medicated. The idea of him engaging in a strenuous physical activity like racquetball seems unlikely. People who saw him in his final weeks described him as lethargic and bloated. He was not an athlete at this point in his life. The accounts of the game itself are thin. Ginger Alden mentions it, as does Billy Smith, but the details are sparse. It feels more like a casual hangout in the racquetball building than a serious game. The building had a lounge and a piano, so it's possible they were just there to relax. But the story has evolved into an Elvis played racquetball on the night he died fact. The book, Elvis: The Last 24 Hours by Albert Goldman paints a much grimmer picture. Goldman's biography is controversial for its harsh tone, but he was a meticulous researcher. He suggests that the game was a pathetic attempt at normalcy, that Elvis was so uncoordinated he could barely hit the ball, that it was more sad than fun. This contradicts the lighter version of the story where everyone is laughing and having a good time. So, we have a conflict. Was it a fun, spontaneous game that showed Elvis's playful side? Or was it a sad, feeble effort by a sick man to feel normal for a moment? Or, a third possibility, was the game exaggerated? Perhaps they just went to the building, sat around, and the story of an actual game was added later to make the night sound more active and less like a prelude to death. The racquetball game serves a narrative purpose. It counters the image of Elvis as a recluse sitting in his room taking pills. It makes him seem engaged with life. What really happened in that racquetball building in the early hours of August 16th? Was there a real game, or were they just hanging out in the lounge? If they did play, was it the lighthearted fun some describe, or the pathetic scene others imply? And why is this small, strange event such an important part of the official story of his last night? Is it another piece of myth-making to create a more vibrant image of his final hours? Number 11. Who gave him the last Demirol injection? This is one of the darkest and most disputed parts of the story. It involves a direct accusation of someone injecting Elvis with a powerful painkiller shortly before he died. The person at the center of this claim is his stepbrother, Rick Stanley. In the original edition of the book he co-wrote, Elvis, We Love You Tender, Rick Stanley claimed that he administered a shot of Demirol to Elvis on the night of his death. A Demirol is a potent opioid narcotic. If true, this would be a bombshell. It would mean that Elvis received a powerful, potentially lethal drug administered by an unlicensed person just hours before his heart stopped. This account created a firestorm. It directly implicated Rick Stanley in the events leading to Elvis's death. It also pointed a finger at the culture of drug use that surrounded Elvis. The so-called Redneck Doctor's Desk reference, a book with information on prescription drugs, was a staple at Graceland. The members of his entourage were often tasked with getting and administering medications. But then, the story changed. In later interviews and in subsequent editions of the book, Rick Stanley recanted his story. He said he had been mistaken. He said he was confusing that night with other nights. He claimed that he had not given Elvis a shot on August 16th. This is a massive reversal. You don't just mistake giving a drug injection to Elvis Presley on the night he died. So why the change? Was he pressured to change his story? The Presley estate and the inner circle were always fiercely protective of Elvis's image. A story about his stepbrother shooting him up with narcotics on his deathbed is the exact kind of story they would want to suppress. It makes Elvis look like a helpless addict and his family look like enablers. Or did Rick Stanley lie in the first place? Was he trying to make his own role in Elvis's life seem more important, more central? Was it a way to sell books? David Stanley, Rick's brother, has also given shifting accounts of the drug use at Graceland over the years. In his book, The Elvis Encyclopedia, he is more direct about the rampant drug abuse. The Stanley brothers were young men caught up in an insane world. Their memories might be genuinely confused by years of chaos. But the Demerol injection is a specific damning detail. Dr. Nicopolis always maintained that he was trying to wean Elvis off of dangerous drugs by using placebos. He would sometimes give Elvis injections of saline solution. Is it possible that Rick Stanley gave Elvis a shot, but it was just a placebo? This would explain the memory of giving an injection, but it wouldn't explain the presence of real drugs in Elvis's system. And it doesn't explain why Rick would initially claim it was Demerol. The toxicology report did not find Demerol, but it found high levels of another opiate, codeine, which had been prescribed by Elvis's dentist. This complicates the story even further. Did Rick Stanley actually inject Elvis with Demerol that night and then lie about it to protect himself and the family? Or did he invent the story for attention, only to retract it when he realized the legal and personal consequences? Could he have administered a different drug or a placebo and simply misremembered what it was? The truth of this single event could change our entire understanding of Elvis's final conscious hours. Here, number 10, was he reading a book when he died? The image is iconic. It's been repeated in books, documentaries, and even jokes for decades. Elvis Presley died on the toilet reading a book. The book, as the story goes, was The Scientific Search for the Face of Jesus by Franco Adams. This detail has become a key part of the Elvis death mythology. It adds a layer of intellectual or spiritual curiosity to an otherwise grim and undignified scene. It suggests he was a seeker, a man grappling with big questions right up to the very end. Larry Geller, Elvis's spiritual guide, is the primary source for this story. Geller had introduced Elvis to a world of spiritual and esoteric books. He often said that Elvis was a deep thinker, constantly searching for meaning. For Geller, the fact that Elvis died reading a book about Jesus was proof of his spiritual quest. It was a meaningful, almost poetic end, but Ginger Alden, the person who actually found his body, tells a different story. In her initial statements and in her book, she describes a much more visceral scene. She found him on the floor of the bathroom in a fetal position, his pajama bottoms around his ankles. He had clearly fallen forward off the toilet. Her focus was on the horror of finding him unresponsive. She doesn't mention a book. In the shock and panic of that moment, a book on the floor would likely have been an insignificant detail. So where did the book come from? Did it appear in the story later? It's possible. In the aftermath of his death, there was a massive effort to shape the narrative. The Elvis died reading a spiritual book story is a much better, much cleaner story than Elvis died of a drug-related event on the toilet. It transforms the scene from one of physical distress and overdose to one of quiet contemplation. Alana Nash's reporting in Elvis and the Memphis Mafia highlights how stories were often polished or created by the inner circle to protect Elvis's image. The book could easily be one of those details. It's also possible the book was in the bathroom. Elvis was known to read there, but was he holding it when he died? That's the key question. The act of holding the book implies a peaceful passing, a man engrossed in reading who is suddenly struck down. The reality, according to medical experts who have reviewed the case, was likely a violent, sudden event. The medical term is Valsalva's maneuver. Straining on the toilet causes already weak heart to stop. It would have been an instantaneous collapse. He would not have had time to gently place a book down. The persistence of the book story shows how much we want to believe in a good death for our heroes. We don't want to imagine the grim biological reality. The book provides a comforting detail, a narrative life raft, but it may be a complete fiction. It's a classic example of what psychologists call a flashbulb memory, a highly detailed, vivid memory of a shocking event. But research has shown these memories are often full of errors. The central event is remembered, finding the body, but the peripheral details, like a book on the floor, can be wrong or even implanted later. So, was the book really in his hands, or even in the room, or was it a detail added later by people like Larry Geller to create a more spiritual, less sordid end for the king? Could the book have been on a nearby table, and its role in the story was exaggerated over time? What does it say about us that we are so attached to this one small, unverified detail of his death? Number 9. What were his last words? A person's last words are supposed to be profound. They are the final statement of a life. For Elvis Presley, his reported last words are simple, mundane, and a source of controversy. The person who heard them was his fiancée, Ginger Alden. According to her account, sometime in the morning of August 16th, Elvis was heading into his bathroom, and she told him not to fall asleep in there. His reply, she says, was, "I won't." Those were his final words to her. This exchange has been repeated as fact for decades. It's a simple human moment. It's not poetic, but it feels real. It's a small piece of domestic conversation between two people. But like every other detail of that day, it's not without its problems. The only person who heard these words was Ginger Alden. There are no other witnesses. We have to take her word for it. And many people, including members of Elvis's own inner circle, have questioned her accounts of that day over the years. Some of the skepticism comes from the fact that her story has been polished and refined over time, particularly in her 2014 book. In the immediate aftermath, she was a traumatized young woman. Her statements were likely confused. As the years went on, the story became more set, more concrete. Is "I won't" the real, literal last thing he said? Or is it the memory of the last conversation she had with him, simplified into a single line? The alternative to this story is that there were no memorable last words. The reality is probably that he said something mundane and unremarkable before closing the bathroom door. Or maybe he said nothing at all. The need for last words is a powerful one. It provides closure. It gives us a final piece of dialogue. The "I won't" story is good because of its tragic irony. He tells her he won't fall asleep in the bathroom, and then he dies in there. It's a neat, sad little story. Other members of the Memphis Mafia have expressed doubts, not necessarily about the words themselves, but about the whole picture Ginger painted of their relationship and his final hours. Some felt she was an outsider who didn't truly understand the world she had entered. In books like Alana Nash's, you get a sense of the tension between Ginger and the longtime members of the entourage. They saw her as a newcomer, and her version of events was just one of many. The context of the conversation is also important. Elvis had a habit of reading in the bathroom. It was his private space, his escape. He would spend hours in there. So Ginger's comment about not falling asleep was likely a common one. It wasn't a premonition, it was just part of their routine. But because of what happened next, this simple exchange has been given immense weight. So were his last words really, "I won't"? Or is this a memory that has been shaped by tragedy and the need for a good story? Could his actual last words have been something completely different? Or was there no final exchange at all? And why do we place so much importance on these two simple words when the medical evidence of his death tells a much more complex and disturbing story? How Elvis Presley's body was found is a critical and gruesome detail. It's also one where the stories diverge in small but significant ways. The position of the body can give medical clues about the time and manner of death. And the inconsistencies in the descriptions raise questions about what people really saw in that moment of panic. The main witness is, again, Ginger Alden. She was the one who opened the bathroom door and found him. In her most detailed account, she describes him on the floor in front of the toilet. He was face down, his body in a fetal position. His pajama bottoms were down around his ankles. He had bitten his tongue. His face was discolored and bloated. It's a horrific image. She says she tried to turn him over but couldn't. Joe Esposito, Elvis's road manager, was one of the first people on the scene after Ginger called for help. His description is similar. He also remembers Elvis face down on the floor. He and Alstrada, another aide, were the ones who managed to turn the body over before the paramedics arrived. The detail about him being face down is consistent in the main accounts. However, the small details vary. Some early reports and rumors suggested he was found slumped over on the toilet. This is a less messy image and was part of the initial cleaned up story, but the eyewitnesses who were there are firm that he was on the floor. The medical evidence supports this. The condition he died from, cardiac arrhythmia, likely triggered by straining, would have caused a sudden forward collapse. But then there's the question of lividity. Lividity is the settling of blood in the lower parts of the body after death, causing a purplish-red discoloration of the skin. Paramedics and medical personnel who saw the body noted that the lividity was on his back. This would suggest he had been lying on his back for some time, but Ginger Alden and Joe Esposito say he was found face down. They turned him over. If he had only been on his back for a few minutes before the paramedics arrived, would the lividity have had time to set in that way? This discrepancy has led to some of the more extreme theories about his death. Some have suggested that he died elsewhere and was moved. This is highly unlikely and not supported by any credible evidence. A more plausible explanation is that the memory of the exact position is slightly off. In a moment of extreme trauma, details can become jumbled, or the medical observations about lividity were not as precise as they were later reported to be. The book The Death of Elvis, What Really Happened by Charles C. Thompson II and James P. Cole goes deep into the medical evidence. They argue that the signs of lividity suggest Elvis had been dead for many hours before he was found, much longer than the official timeline suggests. If he was face down, the blood would have settled in the front of his body. The reports of lividity on his back are a major medical contradiction. So how do we reconcile these accounts? Was he found face down, as the eyewitnesses insist? If so, why did medical personnel report lividity on his back? Could he have been in a different position, perhaps on his side, and the memory has been simplified to face down? Or were the first responders mistaken in their assessment of the lividity in a chaotic and high-pressure situation? The exact position of his body is a forensic detail that just doesn't add up. Number 7. Who found the body first? The story is simple. Ginger Alden found Elvis. She was his fiancée. She woke up, realized he wasn't in bed, and went looking for him. She opened the bathroom door and made the horrific discovery. This is the official version of events. It's her story, and she has stuck to it for over 40 years, but was she truly alone? And was she the first to see him? The timeline of that afternoon is a blur of panic. According to Ginger's account in her book, after she found him, she called down to the kitchen on the intercom. Alstrada, one of Elvis's bodyguards, answered. She then called Joe Esposito. This is where things get a bit cloudy. In some accounts, it seems like Joe Esposito and Alstrada arrived at the room almost immediately. Did they see the body at the same time as Ginger, or moments after? Joe Esposito's own recollections in interviews and in his book Good Rockin' Tonight place him at the center of the action. He describes taking charge, trying to perform CPR, and calling the ambulance. His role becomes very active very quickly. The question isn't whether Ginger found him. It's about the moments right after. Was there a period where she was alone with the body, trying to process what she was seeing? Or did the room fill with people almost instantly? The distinction matters. It changes the dynamic from a private tragedy to a group crisis. Then there is the persistent rumor that someone else may have known something was wrong before Ginger did. Elvis's aunt, Delta Mae Biggs, lived at Graceland. She was an early riser. Some have speculated that she may have found the body first and, in a state of panic, didn't know what to do. This is pure speculation, but it's part of the mythology of that day. It stems from the belief by some in the inner circle that the official timeline doesn't quite work. The focus on Ginger as the sole discoverer also served a narrative purpose. She was the tragic fiancée. It made the story cleaner. If a bodyguard or a relative found him, it becomes a different kind of story, less personal. The timing of the discovery is also tied to the time of death. If Ginger found him around 1:30 or 2 p.m., as she claims, and he had been dead for hours, it means his body lay undiscovered for a long time. This raises questions about why no one checked on him sooner. The house was full of people. Elvis's routine was well known. His absence for that long should have been noticed. This is why some people, like the authors of The Death of Elvis, question the entire timeline of discovery. So while Ginger Alden was undoubtedly the one who raised the alarm, was she the first person to lay eyes on Elvis's body that day? How quickly did Joe Esposito and Al Strada arrive, and what was their initial role? Was the scene one of a lone grieving woman or a chaotic room full of people from the very first second? The question of who saw what and when is another blurry snapshot from a day of chaos. In a moment of crisis, who do you call first? Your answer says a lot about your priorities. According to some accounts, Ginger Alden's first phone call after finding Elvis was not for help, and it was to her mother. This is a detail that has been used by her critics for years to question her actions and her motives. The official story, the one Ginger tells, is that she found Elvis and immediately called for help within the house, using the intercom to contact Al Strada and Joe Esposito. She then called for an ambulance. This is the logical, expected sequence of events. But another version of the story emerged, promoted by some members of the Memphis Mafia, and reported in books like Albert Goldman's Elvis. In this version, Ginger, in a state of shock, called her own mother, Joe Alden, before she alerted anyone at Graceland. If this is true, it's a damning detail. It suggests a delay in getting medical help to Elvis. It suggests her first instinct was not to save him, but to talk to her mom. Why would this alternative story exist? Part of it stems from the resentment some of the inner circle felt towards Ginger. They saw her as an outsider. They were protective of Elvis, even in death, and any action that could be seen as negligent was scrutinized. The story of her calling her mother first fit a narrative that she was not fully committed to Elvis, that she was more concerned with herself. Ginger has vehemently denied this. She maintains she called for help immediately. It's her word against the rumors and accusations of others. It's impossible to prove what happened without phone records from that day, which are not publicly available. But let's consider the psychology of trauma. It is entirely possible that in a state of pure panic, a young woman's first instinct might be to call her mother. It might not be a logical choice, but a purely emotional, instinctual one. Or it's possible she made multiple calls in rapid succession and the exact order has been misremembered or deliberately misrepresented. She could have called for help and then, while waiting for them to arrive, called her mother. The sequence is everything. The timeline is incredibly tight. The call to the Memphis Fire Department for an ambulance was logged at 2:33 p.m. If Ginger found him around 2 p.m., that leaves over half an hour. What happened in that 30 minutes? It's a long time in a medical emergency. This is the window where the questions about her actions arise. The official explanation is that it took time to assess the situation, to try to revive him, and to make the call. The critical explanation is that this time was wasted. So what is the truth? Did Ginger Alden follow a logical protocol in a crisis, or did her personal emotions cause a delay in the emergency response? Was the story of her calling her mother first a malicious rumor spread by those who disliked her? Or is it a detail that reveals a different, more complicated truth about her actions in those first critical minutes after finding the king of rock and roll dead on the floor? Number 5, the blue pills. On the night he died, Elvis took a cocktail of prescription drugs. This is not in dispute. Dr. Nicopolis had prepared several packets of medications for him to take on his upcoming tour. These packets were clearly labeled with the times he was supposed to take them. According to Ginger Alden, just before he went to the bathroom for the last time, Elvis took one of these packets. In her book, Ginger describes watching him take the pills, but she also mentions something else. She says she saw him with a third vial of pills, one she didn't recognize. She said the pills were blue. She asked him what they were, and he brushed off the question. This is a small but potentially explosive detail. What were these blue pills? Were they part of his prescribed regimen from Dr. Nick? Or were they something else? Something he got from another source? Dr. Nick's whole defense during his medical board hearings and trial was that he was trying to control Elvis's drug intake. He claimed many of the pills he gave Elvis were actually placebos, sugar pills designed to make Elvis think he was getting the drugs he craved. Dr. Nick insisted that the last packet of medications he gave Elvis contained only placebos. If that's true, then what were the blue pills Ginger saw? If they were real active medication, it would mean Elvis was getting drugs from another source, behind Dr. Nick's back. This would fit a pattern of behavior. Elvis was known to have multiple doctors and to get prescriptions from anyone he could. It would also explain the high level of drugs found in his system, or perhaps the blue pills were the placebos. Blue is a common color for pills, including some sedatives like Valium. But it could also be a simple dye for a placebo. If the blue pills were placebos, then Ginger's observation doesn't mean much. The problem is no one knows for sure. It's a fleeting observation from one person. The pills were never identified. After his death, the house was cleaned by members of the entourage. Illicit drugs and paraphernalia were reportedly removed to protect his image. Any evidence of these mysterious blue pills would have disappeared at that time. This detail is important because it goes to the heart of the matter. Was Elvis's death an accident caused by a well-meaning but misguided doctor? Or was it the result of his own out-of-control drug-seeking behavior? The blue pills could be the key. They represent the unknown, the uncontrolled part of his addiction. They are a loose thread in Dr. Nick's carefully constructed story of trying to manage a difficult patient. So what were the blue pills Ginger Alden saw? Were they powerful sedatives from an unknown source that contributed to his death? Were they harmless placebos, as Dr. Nick's supporters might claim? Or is it possible that in the haze of memory, the detail of a specific, unrecognized pill was an error, a false memory from a traumatic night? We will likely never know. What does a king eat for his last meal? In Elvis's case, even this simple fact is a matter of debate. The story of his final meal contributes to the image of his health and state of mind. Was he binging on junk food, a sign of his unhealthy lifestyle? Or was he eating lightly, perhaps trying to take better care of himself before his tour? One popular version of the story is that Elvis ate a huge meal of spaghetti and meatballs. This fits the common image of his later years, the bloated Elvis with a prodigious appetite for fried peanut butter and banana sandwiches and other comfort foods. A big, heavy meal late at night would also be consistent with the medical theory that he died while straining on the toilet. A large amount of food in his system could have contributed to the problem. But other accounts contradict this. Some members of the household staff reported that he ate much more lightly. The menu that night might have included ice cream or yogurt. Ginger Alden in her book mentions that he had 4 scoops of ice cream and some cookies. This is still not a health food meal, but it's a far cry from a massive plate of pasta. It paints a picture of a man having a late-night snack, not a huge, gluttonous feast. The discrepancy matters. The spaghetti and meatball story reinforces the caricature of the overweight, unhealthy Elvis. It makes his death seem like an almost inevitable consequence of his lifestyle. The ice cream and cookies story is a little softer. It's more of a guilty pleasure than a full-on binge. It makes him seem more human, less of a cartoon. So why the 2 different stories? It could be a simple case of misremembering. The Graceland kitchen serves a lot of people, and records of who ate what on a specific night over 40 years ago are likely non-existent. It's also possible he ate both. He might have had a meal earlier and a snack later. But it's also possible that the story was exaggerated over time. Elvis's last meal was 4 scoops of ice cream. Doesn't have the same punch as Elvis ate a huge plate of spaghetti and meatballs right before he died. The more dramatic story is the one that tends to stick. The food he ate is a small detail, but it's part of the larger puzzle of his health. His diet was notoriously bad. His autopsy revealed a severely impacted colon, a condition known as megacolon, which was likely exacerbated by his diet and his use of opiate painkillers, which caused constipation. Whatever he ate that night, it was entering a system that was already in serious trouble. So what did he really eat in the early hours of August 16th? Was it a massive pasta dinner, a simple bowl of ice cream, or something else entirely? Does the confusion over his last meal simply reflect the chaotic nature of the Graceland household? Or has the story been shaped over the years to better fit the tragic narrative of his final unhealthy decline? The bathroom where Elvis died was his sanctuary. He called it his office. It was a lavishly decorated space with a huge sunken tub, gold fixtures, and a throne-like toilet. It was his private retreat from the world. The condition of this room when his body was found should be a simple factual matter. But even here, the accounts differ. Most accounts agree on the basics. He was found on the floor between the toilet and the shower. The scene was medically grim, but what about the rest of the room? Was it neat and tidy? Or was it a mess, a scene of chaos? Some reports, particularly in the more sensational biographies like Albert Goldman's, describe a scene of disarray. They mention vomit on the carpet. This detail paints a picture of a violent, convulsive death. It suggests a body in extreme distress. The presence of vomit would be strong evidence of a drug overdose, as it is a common physiological reaction. However, other key witnesses, including Joe Esposito and the paramedics who arrived on the scene, do not mention this. In their descriptions of the efforts to revive Elvis, they don't talk about having to navigate a soiled or messy room. Ginger Alden's account also focuses on the position of the body, not the state of the room. If the scene was as messy as some claim, it seems like it would be a memorable detail for the first responders. The absence of this detail in the primary accounts is significant. So where did the story of the vomit come from? Was it a piece of unsubstantiated gossip that got printed as fact? Or was it a real detail that was deliberately omitted from the official narrative to make the death scene less sordid? The Presley family and the Memphis Mafia were intensely focused on image management. A detail like that would have been the first thing they'd want to clean up, both literally and figuratively. The condition of the room is a forensic question. A clean scene suggests a sudden, instantaneous event like a heart attack. A messy scene, with signs of physical sickness, points more towards a drug overdose. The two descriptions support the two competing theories of his death. It's another example of how the narrative was shaped. Those who wanted to believe the heart attack story remember or report a clean scene. Those who believed the overdose story report a messy one. It is a Rorschach test for how people viewed his death. So, what was the true state of Elvis's private bathroom on that day? Was it the scene of a sudden clean collapse? Or was there physical evidence of a body racked by a drug reaction? Was the story of the messy scene an exaggeration for dramatic effect, or was it a real and damning detail that was scrubbed from the official record and the memories of those trying to protect the king's image? Dr. George Nicopolis, or Dr. Nick, is perhaps the most controversial figure in the story of Elvis's death, aside from Elvis himself. He was Elvis's personal physician, and he was the man who prescribed the vast quantities of drugs that Elvis took. Was he a caring doctor trapped in an impossible situation with a demanding celebrity patient? Or was he a glorified drug dealer, an enabler who was complicit in his patient's death? The answer depends on who you ask. On the night of August 15th and the morning of the 16th, Dr. Nick was not physically present at Graceland, but his presence was felt through the packets of medication he had prepared for Elvis's tour. It's Dr. Nick's story, which he told in court and in his book The King and Dr. Nick, was that he was trying to save Elvis. He claimed he was using placebos to try and wean Elvis off the more dangerous drugs. He said the packets he provided for the tour were part of this elaborate deception. He argued that if he had refused to give Elvis any drugs, Elvis would have simply gone to another, less scrupulous doctor who would have given him anything he wanted. He saw himself as performing a difficult balancing act, trying to control an uncontrollable patient. The prosecution at his 1981 trial for overprescribing medication painted a very different picture. They presented evidence that in the last 2 years of Elvis's life, Dr. Nick had prescribed over 12,000 doses of narcotics, amphetamines, and sedatives. The sheer volume of pills was staggering. They argued that no responsible doctor would ever prescribe medication on this scale. They saw him as a man who had been corrupted by celebrity, who was more interested in keeping his famous patient happy than in keeping him healthy. Members of the Memphis Mafia are also split. Some saw Dr. Nick as a friend who was trying his best in a crazy situation. Others, like Elvis's bodyguard Sonny West, were more critical, believing that Dr. Nick was in over his head and should have done more to stop the drug abuse. The key inconsistency lies in the intent behind Dr. Nick's actions. Did he genuinely believe he was helping Elvis by controlling the supply of drugs and using placebos? Or was that a story he invented after Elvis's death to cover his own culpability? The fact that Elvis died with a system full of real, powerful drugs severely undermines Dr. Nick's placebo defense. If his plan was working, why was Elvis still so heavily medicated? The jury at his trial ultimately acquitted him of criminal charges, perhaps believing that he did not act with malicious intent. However, the Tennessee Board of Medical Examiners saw things differently. They revoked his medical license in 1995, finding that his prescribing practices were unethical. So who was the real Dr. Nick? Was he a compassionate but weak man who was manipulated by a powerful addict? Or was he a reckless doctor who enabled his patients' self-destruction in exchange for fame and fortune? Did his actions on the days leading up to August 16th constitute a legitimate, if unconventional, medical strategy, or were they the final acts of gross negligence that led directly to the king's death? When did Elvis Presley actually die? This should be the simplest fact of all. But it is the most profound and unsettling inconsistency. The official timeline is that he was found by Ginger Alden around 2 p.m. on August 16th. The ambulance was called at 2:33 p.m. He was pronounced dead at Baptist Memorial Hospital at 3:30 p.m. but the medical evidence suggests he may have been dead for much, much longer. The key lies in the state of the body. When the paramedics arrived, they reportedly saw signs of rigor mortis, the stiffening of the body after death. Rigor mortis typically begins within 2 to 6 hours after death and is fully established at around 12 hours. If his body was already showing signs of stiffness in the mid-afternoon, it suggests he died much earlier in the day. Then there is the issue of lividity, which we discussed earlier, the settling of the blood that causes discoloration. This process also takes hours. The fact that medical personnel noted established lividity also points to a much earlier time of death. In their book, The Death of Elvis, authors Thompson and Cole argue that based on the forensic evidence, Elvis likely died sometime between 7 a.m. and 9 a.m. If this is true, it means his body lay undiscovered in his bathroom for at least 5 hours, possibly more. This contradicts the timeline given by Ginger Alden. She said she last saw him alive around 9:30 a.m. when he was going into the bathroom. If he died at 9 a.m., her timeline is only slightly off. But if he died earlier, say at 7 a.m., then her account of seeing him at 9:30 a.m. is impossible. Why would the timeline be so wrong? The simplest explanation is that in the trauma and chaos of the event, people's memories of time became distorted. A few hours could feel like minutes, but a more cynical view is that the timeline was deliberately manipulated. The image of Elvis lying dead and undiscovered for many hours in his own home is a tragic and pathetic one. It suggests a level of neglect and isolation that the estate would not want to promote. A shorter timeline makes the tragedy seem more sudden, more immediate, and less lonely. If he did die in the morning, it raises a host of other questions. Why didn't anyone check on him? Graceland was a busy house, staff and family were always around. Was it normal for him to be out of contact for that many hours? The members of the Memphis Mafia say yes, Elvis kept odd hours. He slept during the day. It was not unusual for him to be left alone for long periods. The time of death is the central mystery. It's the anchor for all the other events of the day. If we don't know when he died, we can't know the true sequence of anything else. The medical evidence points one way, and the eyewitness accounts point another. They cannot both be right. What is the real time of death? Did he die shortly after going into the bathroom in the mid-morning, as Ginger Alden's account suggests? Or did he die many hours earlier, lying alone and undiscovered, as the forensic evidence seems to indicate? Was the official timeline a product of confused memory, or was it a deliberate choice to create a more palatable story for the public? And what does it mean if the king of rock and roll died completely alone and no one even noticed for half a day?